Thank you, Rosalind. It's great to be here. I'm not very familiar with the Republic of Ireland. I've been a few times. I lived as a hippie for a little while in West Cork in the early 80s, but that's probably my only real knowledge of the Republic. But I have recently been going to the north, where there is some emerging participatory budgeting work, linking it with ideas such as co-production and asset-based approaches to community development. Because there's many different reasons to do PB. There are reasons around improving the efficiency of our public services. I know there's some interest in Russia, for example, in using PB as a way of improving transparency and accountability in the absence of other democratic processes. There's certainly interest across the world from politicians about how to deal with the democratic deficit. If you're a young woman in my home city of Manchester, you're probably unlikely to vote. It's down in the 20% or something like that. So that's a real problem, and if you're from a minority community, you may not have the right to vote. So universal suffrage is not true if you are a migrant, or particularly if you're 17, for example. So there are lots of democratic reasons, but I'm really particularly interested in the community development of the reasons for it, because I started this as a community activist in my hometown of Manchester, trying to influence some of the spending that was happening in my community to try and save and improve my local community centre. And before we fought as community activists to get on the partnership board to have some influence on a large regeneration fund. And before the first meeting, the head of regeneration called us in and said, 3 things here: we don't vote, we work by consensus. Which really meant that as community activists and representatives, we had no way of really saying that we didn't approve of what was happening within this board. The second was, we don't quite like how you're trying to meet before the meeting to influence or control the agenda, and the idea that officers and elected members don't meet to write the agenda is a bit strange. And the third was, we spent the money last year anyway, you're too late. So that was my introduction to local democracy. I had the privilege in 2000 to being asked to go to Brazil as a community activist to learn about participatory budgeting, where it started as a named thing. It's obviously been happening everywhere. And I was so turned on by that experience and the kind of the positivity that came through the democratic processes that I've been following it through ever since. Before I go into my presentation, I think I have to press that one. Quick question: who are the hard to reach? Can somebody define the hard to reach? Throw it. Pardon?
Illiterate.
The illiterate. Any other hard to reach people? Yep. Any other hard to reach type of people? Low paid.
How about executives that never return your phone calls?
Exactly right. The really hard to reach is the head of the finance department of your local authority, who's behind 3 levels of reception desk, who speaks an arcane language that nobody in the community understands. So PB is about creating deliberative space between people with different knowledges: local knowledge about the conditions in their community, political knowledge about how to balance interests and make deals, and technical knowledge about how to spend public money. That's valuable. All of those knowledges are valuable, and PB is about creating a space, a process for those different knowledges to come together to spend our money, our collective investment in our society through our taxes more effectively and better. So we're a social enterprise. There's information about us there. Shared Future is the social enterprise. PB Partners is a project of that. We're a small group of people who are working on selling PB, and we support the UK PB network. So there's lots of information on those websites, and if you want to find out more about us, pick up the brochure down there. Here's the graph of doom, picture by Jericho. Load of sailors after the sinking of a famous French ship, a sea, wondering who they're going to throw off the burning raft, or rather the falling apart raft next. This is what austerity has done in the UK. When troubled times are difficult, we have 2 choices. Do we listen to each other, or do we come together collectively and support the weakest? And our experience is that through austerity, our politicians and our officers have become more interested in their own conversations and less interested in the conversing with the community. So that's one of our challenges. And in my home city, 50% cuts after over 5 years in the local authority budget. It's very hard when you're facing these pressures to still be open to new and fresh ideas. But PB is all about this challenge. How do we make sure that everybody is supported when times are difficult? Here's some information. Scottish public opinion data suggests that there is a keen interest for participation in the policy process through mechanisms such as participatory budgeting. So there's a clear link between PB and raising interest in Scotland. It links into that. Now needs to be a discussion on the role of experts, expertise and evidence in policy making. So that was a senior academic from University of Edinburgh going to Wales to talk to Welsh people about Brexit. So there's that link between policy and participation. And here's a definition of PB. PB directly involves local people in making decisions and spending on the priorities for a defined public budget, or local people deciding how to allocate part of a public budget. But I like the one at the bottom I heard about in Brazil best. If it feels like we've decided it's PB, and if it feels like someone else has decided it isn't. It's very much, when you participate in a democratic process, do you feel that your participation has led to change? Or has it been ignored? Because if it has, and you live in poverty, or you live with a time constraints, or you have a low-paid job, why would you go back? Why would you waste your time on a process where you could not see the link between your participation and something actually changing? And there's something about how we leave citizens with a feeling of empowerment. I will not suggest we got all of our cash collectively, put it in a big pile in the middle of the floor, and then I had a bun fight over who gets it. PB is only about a very small percentage of the public budget. Our aspirations, the ones in Scotland under the Community Choices programme, is 1%. 1% of public money being spent through a participatory budgeting process. The PB process always has to be formally mandated and signed off by elected politicians. They have to put money into the pot, and their role is not to make the decisions, but to say, was this process fair, legal, transparent? And if it is, that's great. And if it's not, then they may have to say, let's have some questions about this process, but they have to justify their decision. So it's about supporting representative democracy, not undermining it. It's about making the role of politicians, of officers and citizens clearer. It's about relationships. So it began in Porto Alegre in Brazil at the end of military rule. The money had been stolen by the outgoing dictatorship. There were huge demands for change, and PB was kind of invented in that space where there were huge expectations, but the coffers were dry. And it was almost done as a way of making sure that citizens understood and could contribute to redesigning and rebuilding that city. It was tremendously successful, and it was a democratic innovation. And if you jump forward to Scotland at the moment, it fits in with the agenda for devolution. There's multiple PB experiences, large and small. One local authority has just committed to around £5 million. That's what, €6 million to PB in the next year, so that's quite big scale. And it links into this commitment for the 1%, and there is a move towards choosing scale, and we've seen loads of new examples. There's a website for participatory budgeting PB in Scotland you can learn about. In Scotland, it fitted in with the context of the Community Empowerment Act, a new legal instrument which didn't name PB but implied it. There is some wording within it saying that ministers could hear representations from citizens if they feel that their public services have not involved them. Their programme's called Community Choices, but it also fitted in with things like the Commissioning for Strengthening Democracy, led by the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, which saw PB as one of the ingredients. So it has that backing from a broad base in Scotland over a number of years. It fits into that appetite for the devolution of powers and how PB can answer other people's agendas. In Scotland, there was also this really interesting report done a number of years ago, which I would urge you to read because I think it's applicable to all public services called the Christie Commission, who were looking at the demographic time bomb, the ageing population, the need, the coming austerity, and how we would do that. And it identified 4 things that needed to happen: a shift towards prevention, continual drive towards improvement of performance, working in partnership and developing people. So that's all kind of normal, nice policy kind of words. But they also identified this challenge of producer dominance, that public services tend to choose, and public servants tend to choose solutions they understand, and they control the budget. And so if we're not, we need some way of disrupting this concept of producer dominance, that we know what's best for people, we know how to do this, we're experts, we've spent many years becoming experts, why would we change? So PB is about challenging that power. So the Scottish Government says that PB and that whole Christie Commission transformation is linked into words such as improvement, co-production, and asset-based approaches, that PB is a tool to deliver power more equally between communities, individuals and professionals, and see residents as citizens, as neighbours and co-producers of public service. So that comes directly out of policy language in Scotland at the moment. And some of the successes, well, £2.5 million plus has been invested in loads of different PB processes. This was 2016 information, it's at least double that now, and the likelihood is it's going to continue to grow, particularly with the recent elections, whatever happens, the local elections in Scotland, interestingly, all hung councils, but with strong SNP pressure behind this. Lots of individual projects from very small scale, £750, right up to £500,000 and more. So the point of that is that PB is about principles, it's about values, it's about process. The budget size can vary hugely. It's about applying a process to whatever decision making you make. And there's been a wide range of themes, and also particularly that PB tends to happen in the most disadvantaged communities. We have developed 2 particular models in first England, then in Scotland, but basically within the UK. The first is what's called participatory grant making. So that is money spent in communities, by communities, for communities. And our traditional power relationship, when you apply for money to do something, set up a play group, set up a youth project, improve some wasteland, is to write a long form and send it in to a lot of clever people wearing suits behind a desk, who then write back to you and tell you, have you got the money or not? And generally tell you you haven't. And particularly if you can't write well, they tell you you haven't, because they're basically looking for their own model of what success is. So in our participatory grant making processes, if you want the money, you have to come to your community and make a 3-minute presentation in front of everybody else who wants the money, and everybody votes. And sometimes you get 150 people in the room voting, or sometimes 1,000 people, it varies, or sometimes you go online. But it's a horizontal power relationship between people with common interest and common purpose. And you might think that is a very contested and competitive process, but through good design and good rules and enough time and understanding community development principles, it can be a very empowering process, because fundamentally it's a lot of people standing up saying, I've got this great idea, if you would back me, I would do this, and somebody else doing the same, and then you actually have a ritual of community, a space of positive expression of what is possible in that community. There's mainstream investment, which is, I think, what is normally seen as PB, is about citizens directing public services delivered by public service. But in this age when we're moving towards privatisation and outsourcing and co-production and all that, the boundaries are getting blurred between what is our money, council's money, and somebody else's. So I've gone through that, the small grants allocation. It's really inspiring. I met somebody who had stood up in their community 3 years after an event where £300,000 were distributed, and I said, do you remember speaking in that event? And she said, it was terrifying but magnificent. And I thought, well, that's a different sort of democratic process than most. That's something that's moved people. So it's really good with infusing people, seeing people seeing that they have direct impact, but it doesn't actually impact on the mainstream. It's what sometimes is called PB generation, PB 1.0 for the techie people, but first generation PB. It's often the place you start because politicians and elected officers are quite nervous about trusting experts in the community. So PB grant making is a good entry point. But it's also a good way of getting people involved in wider, bigger conversations. So Tower Hamlets had a process, this is in London, £5 million per year over 2 years, where every citizen got the same offer. Every resident got a kind of a common offer, but certain communities, well, all communities had a specific pot of extra services that they could buy that matched their own local need. So it was mainstream, the money was fundamentally spent by public sector organisations or their key partners, but it was decided on by people participating directly on behalf of their community, 750 people or so coming to a room and voting. And through that, building relationships between community forums and officers in new and interesting ways. It died after 2 years because of austerity. It was happening around 2009-10. Durham mobilised 14,000 residents in 1 month to vote in PB grant-making events in their local communities, but then took 1,500 of those residents who turned up, played a game a bit like Monopoly, talking about the budget constraints that council was facing over many years, and thereby involved 1,500 citizens in deep deliberative conversations about whether it was better to make these trade-offs between different needs. So lots of different ways of thinking about how to do PB, but this is perhaps PB 2.0. This is an interesting approach to mainstream. I'm not going to go into it in great length, and do give me a warning if I'm going far too over, because I do get carried away. So this is what they developed in Brazil. So the idea was that in each locality of the city, there were different localities were defined. They actually asked communities to define their own localities rather than imposing them on them, but that's another story. And then for each locality, for each theme, so perhaps in this case you've got £500,000, and I'm sorry about the pounds, but you know, say €500,000, it's easy to translate. £500,000 to be spent on crime and community safety. And each community has a different local priority. Some communities are more worried about crime than others. And some communities have a different local need. So some communities have higher crime rates than others. And some communities have different scales, different populations. And through this simple mechanism, they come up with a commissioning strategy where they can say, of the £412,000 in this case, we know these communities should receive that amount of spend on crime and community safety. So it's a mechanism for trying to break down the budget, which was based on local people basically saying, this is important to us, officers basically saying, this is what we know about deprivation or crime levels in these communities, and population size, which is what politicians are generally interested in. So you could see it as almost like those three different conversations. That table, the booklets around the budget tables became the second most popular book taken out of public libraries in Porto Alegre. People really got into understanding and talking about the detail, the nitty-gritty of public budgets. This is a PB budget cycle. Whenever you're going to spend money, so here's the situation, there are too many fat people in Dublin. Problem. Maybe there isn't, maybe there is. Somebody's identified that there's a problem about obesity. So if you're going to spend money on reducing obesity, you'll probably go through this cycle. You design a process. You think, how are we going to tackle obesity? What's our budget? What's the scale of our response to this? You might go and inform and engage. You might go and ask clinicians who are experts in childhood obesity, or you might go and talk to academics, look at the evidence base around the world. You then might go and set priorities. You say, well, actually, let's get under this. What's the real problem? Is it old people who are obese, or is it young people? Is it people from particular minority communities? Is it in that community or that, or this place or that place? So you start to set priorities. You come up with various different solutions. Maybe we encourage people to cycle to work, or maybe healthy food, or whatever it might be. This is commissioning. Then you might go into delivering those services, set up lots of projects, get people to do those things. You monitor and scrutinise whether that spend has been done well, and then you evaluate and learn about whether you've actually reduced obesity in Dublin. And the challenge of PB is saying, are citizens involved at each stage of that cycle? Are we involving them in telling us what's important to them about obesity? Are we involving them in delivering services? Are we involving them in informing and engaging each other about the issues around that? And are we helping them in evaluate and learn? So it's all about involving citizens at whatever point in that commissioning process. And what we've seen over years, because you do have to do it over a number of years, is that it builds a more informed body of citizens who are able to engage with increasingly complex issues. You have to start somewhere. Spread across the world, many thousands of cities. Can you give me a time warning? Have I gone?
Oh, you've got 8 full minutes.
Ah, I'm doing well. Maybe we'll have a question. So it's spread across the world. 3,000 or more cities have been defined or self-defined or been labelled as doing PB in one sort of way or another across the whole world. It's been identified as good practice by many international institutions. I'm not going to list them all. We've had many hundreds of experiences in the UK, particularly of the small grant making, relatively few of the bigger mainstream PB. And it links in with a whole range of policies that have been talked about over the last, well, throughout my kind of community development life, about localising, about that we should reduce the level at which decision making takes place wherever possible. Subsidiarity is some of the phrases that's used. So the idea that if there is money to be spent, it's better to spend it with the people who are going to be affected by that spend. So around Latin America, good city called Recife, and when we think of Latin America and Brazil, think of modern cities. I mean, you know, these are big scale places, you know, with well-developed, well-articulated populations. So don't think of it as somewhere in the south. This is big stuff. So they won an interesting prize called the Reinhard Mons Democracy Prize, which was an exercise in PB, because 15,000 citizens, I think, of Germany voted on who should win this prize, so it was a participatory decision-making in the process. They reached hundreds of thousands of people through linking an online and offline PB. They started with offline, face-to-face processes, a bit like citizens' juries or citizens' assemblies, to talk through some of the issues, to think about the priorities, to come up with suggestions. There was an open space where any citizen could suggest ideas on how to improve that city. They went through a filtering process that involved hundreds and hundreds of local community representatives to eventually arrive at a kind of limited number of projects which could be put online, and hundreds of thousands of people voted for those projects. So again, that's about how you link different elements of face-to-face and online participation. It's been going off in New York and Chicago for a number of years now. So I think there's about $5-6 million in Chicago is spent through PB. It's now up to about $32 million in New York, predominantly voted on by people from populations who don't generally vote, so they make real efforts to link it with community organising and ensure that PB supports wider democratic processes. Toronto, they did some really interesting stuff with housing many years ago at scale. You know, housing associations, social housing providers, the budgets that they spend often come from tenants. So there's a natural democratic process of involving tenants through the community forums, residents forums, and they added PB into that as part of the mix. And the City of Boston have a really interesting youth-led PB process, so $1 million a year. It's just for young people to participate to build citizens of the future. And they recently did a $700,000 one in Seattle, and what was really interesting was that of the $700,000, $300,000 of that was spent on homelessness, on young people voting on projects which weren't just about young people. So there's some really interesting evidence about intergenerational relationships that are built through PB as well. Around Europe, many different examples, you begin to look at them. Latin countries tend to be more democratic and socialist and reformist in their culture around this. The German countries, the Germanic, the North tends to be more managerial and sort of consultative. So there's no one model, Portugal has got a national PB programme. They even had some ideas that people could vote through cash point machines. I think that was a bit fanciful, but they've got many local and a national PB programme, so thinking about how you could open up the national budget to citizen participation. And obviously Paris, we've talked about, 426 million euros through PB, 5% of the city's capital budget. But what's really interesting from that example is the range of ideas that have come forward outside of the participatory budgeting and how those have been picked up by different agencies in Paris. And so it's become part of the culture that actually you don't just make decisions for people, but you involve them, you ask them for ideas. So there's many spin-out benefits around that 5%. And Iceland, talked about again already, all that stuff around how they responded to austerity and used democratic processes to rebuild their democratic models. PB's linked to that. Particularly like this story from Belo Horizonte in Brazil, widely regarded as a city that ended hunger. It's got, at the time certainly that this study came out about 5 or 6 years ago, it had lower food poverty rates than most North American cities in terms of social inequality. And they did all sorts of things linked to PB, where they redesigned the local food economy, brought fresh food into the city centre by changing the regulations around permits, setting up accessible food outlets, social enterprises offering good food that everybody could buy, and all sorts of different mechanisms. And that started with this concept as that the status of a citizen surpasses that of a mere consumer. Many examples from Scotland. I'm not going to go through all of these because we're getting short on time. I know Rosalind said that this presentation can be circulated afterwards, and if people want to contact me, you can certainly get it. So many different examples that have been running over many years from Scotland. I would advise you to go to the pbscotland.scot website to see all of those. But really interesting ones about mental health, around ex-mining villages, redefining the sort of the future of those areas. Particularly interesting one in Scotland with the police tackling Islamophobia through participatory budgeting in the last few periods. And lots of good responses from people involved in those. Here's some of the principles. It's got to be a long-term endeavour. It's got to require strong leadership, time and resource. It has to have political buy-in. It should enable an authentic representation of community interest. It must recognise the challenge of engaging socially excluded citizens. You actually have to do some hard work around that. And here's some defining characteristics. It's about public budgets. It's about having that direct impact. It's got to have a deliberative element somewhere along the line. It's got to be a process designed to ensure that citizens can monitor public spending, and it's got to be repeated periodically. And I like this phrase: the truth about an authority's aspirations isn't found in its vision, it's found in its budget. I'm not going to go into that slide. That's all about the importance of evaluating PB, making sure that you capture the evidence. There's obviously a close link with open government. We're going to hear from other speakers about open knowledge. It's linked to that. Scotland has got an embedded commitment of 1%. In Ireland, I think it's a feasibility study at this point. So there's thinking within the Irish OGP process. I hope that's not unfair to say that, but it has been kind of embedded in Scotland. A couple of final slides. Deep change will take time. There is evidence that PB reduces social inequality, but it can take 5 years to make that happen. So that's a challenge when our democratic processes are less than 5 years. How do we ensure it sustains and grows for long enough? Because we're not going to change the future with a few £1,000s at the margin. Even with €300,000, we're not going to change the future. So there are lots of challenges about losing control, about political parties. There's a challenge about, should we do PB when there's austerity? But that's a bit like asking finger or toe first, citizens. So there's some challenges around that. So my final slide really is that there must be a convincing story to tell for politicians, for officers and citizens. It's about making sure all of those participants in our democratic processes are strongly behind this. So it's about making sure we understand how we can talk to those different constituencies. So that's a quick run through of some of the principles. I'm sorry about deluging you with PB in a short period of time. Thank you.